At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. So we are back here with Mike Comparetto. He's a licensed therapist specializing in anxiety and mindfulness. I love talking to Mike about mindfulness. And he uses acceptance and commitment therapy. And he's been on our show a few times before. I'm so glad you're back. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back.
I'm so glad you're here. Our show today is going to be about anxiety and specifically the relationship between looking at some emotions in a different way and how that has a beneficial effect on our anxiety. A lot of times when people start with me who come to me because of anxiety, they usually have two emotional or mental states. It's either anxious or not anxious. I find that their emotional spectrum is pretty limited. When we do work together and we learn some more emotional language and use some mindfulness around the emotions and acceptance, their anxiety goes down quite a bit. And so I wanted to use this episode to explore, why this phenomenon happens and some tips for the listeners. So the first part will be focusing on why this emotional work soothes the nervous system as one of the reasons why this emotional work is so important to decreasing your anxiety. And then part two, exploring more healthy ways to experience your emotions, your anxiety, moving into more acceptance and some of this emotional healing. Before we jump into that, I wanted to talk about how the both of us define emotional work. When I use the term emotional work, what I'm talking about is pretty specific. The first thing that my clients and I do is we get good at identifying the emotions beyond the anxiety. And what that looks like is using emotional charts. I have an emotional chart that has 300 emotions on it, broken up into 4 different categories. And depending on what category your emotion is, it kind of helps know how to approach it. For example, one of the categories is mental emotions, which are emotions that have a lot of cognitive beliefs intertwined with them. Like anger is a really good example. We get angry because we believe that in this situation, the person should do X. Another category on the chart is emotions that are tied to the nervous system, a lot of that anxiety, concern. But even that, being able to pick apart, it's not just anxiety, it's a certain type of concern. It's really feeling jittery. And then another category are emotions that are really linked to past trauma, those feelings of rejection and abandonment. And then moving into noticing how the emotions feel in your body. And one of the reasons that's so important is because it allows you to take a step away from the cognitive process, learn how to move out of the cognitive part of the experience. And then changing that cognitive experience into something that's a little bit more intentional and conscious, for example, validating, self-compassion. For you, Mike, when you might use the term emotional work, what does that look like for you?
Not very different. Pretty much everything you just said. I think we need to define what is an emotion. I think most of us take that for granted. Yeah, I know what an emotion is. You do. I'm not saying you don't, but it's important to break it down and look at all of the things going on in an emotion. We have, as you pointed out, a cognitive component to that. What are we thinking? What is the quality of our thinking like? What is happening in our mind? We have a neurochemical component, which can be related to our thinking, but can also produce a general feeling state in the mind. Then we have a hormonal component, things like cortisol, adrenaline, things like norepinephrine. Then there's, as you pointed out, the physiological component of an emotion. Then there's the meaning we make of that emotion. Then there's the cultural influences of an emotion. How does the culture that we live in, or the culture or the family system that we were raised in, treat this emotion or interpret this emotion? So when we say we're feeling an emotion, there's actually a lot happening. If we're going to do any type of emotional work, there's a lot of different components that we could work with. And you just named a pretty great system for going through many of those components. But I think one of those components that I focus on that you didn't name is, am I noticing that they're clenching their fists as they're telling this story? Am I noticing that they're looking down at the floor and kind of shying away from me? These are all important components of an emotional response.
It is really true that it's very complicated and there's all these different layers, and really unpeeling those layers and understanding them can be helpful. And one of the layers that I think that can be really important is the fear layer. This fear that a lot of us associate with experiencing this emotion, and that fear can be based in all different things. It could be simply because we were brought up to not necessarily be emotional. And so then there's this fear of having the emotion because then you're doing something wrong. Let's go into talking about the nervous system and how soothing the nervous system can be achieved by simply being more aware of these emotions, turning our experience more toward the emotional end, more toward like how is this affecting my body? How is this affecting my heart? If you want to get a little bit spiritual in that way, and turning away from the thinking can really soothe your nervous system.
I've lived my whole life with an anxiety disorder, and I'm an open book about it. One story that comes to mind that I think is, in hindsight, very comical, didn't feel very funny at the moment. So I was in between my freshman and sophomore year of college, and I was home for the summer, and I got a summer job as a groundskeeper, and I was out mowing lawns all day, sitting on a ride-on lawnmower and, digging trenches and, stuff like that. And I come home exhausted, and I plop down on the couch, and I'm sitting there, and I notice this sudden anxiety start to wash over me. And this was at a period of my life where my anxiety was probably in general at the highest it's ever been. I immediately have this reaction to it. And one of the symptoms that I used to get that used to really bother me was I would get this like flush of adrenaline through my forearms. And I felt that happening. And, I got so frustrated. I was like, oh, a long day. All I want to do is relax. And then I looked down and I realized that my arms are sunburned. What had actually happened was I felt the physical sensation of sunburn, but because of the relationship I had with anxiety, because of how much it had been plaguing me for so long and how much I feared it, it created actual anxiety. So the initial trigger was a very normal physiological response, and it turned into, I almost had a panic attack. I associated the sensation with this, what I'm going to call an umbrella term, even though anxiety is an emotion. And for the purposes of today's podcast, I really want to look at it as an umbrella term, because there are many, many components to what anxiety is. And when you just say, I'm anxious, it brings so much weight and so many things. And in my case, at least, I'll speak for myself, so much baggage with it. This cognitive process of saying, I'm anxious, coupled with this physiological, emotional process of fearing the sensation, sent me down a spiral of anxiety.
What you're saying is that what we think in our minds, what we come up in our minds, these conclusions can make our anxiety worse, can worsen our nervous system response. It also can cause a nervous system response. Exactly. And, I've heard some different ways to go about this. Some people will say, instead of saying I'm anxious, to use the word excited. I'm excited. I've tried that. It doesn't work for me, but right. Technically the term excited means like activated. So it's correct. It just doesn't feel right. But I think saying my nervous system is activated, or in your case, no, actually my nervous system isn't activated and my arms are sunburned, can be super helpful. But some other cognitive experiences that I find a lot of people and myself needing to kind of turn away from are, I shouldn't be feeling this way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't like that I get anxious. Why do I have to be like this? What's wrong with me? Or I need to tough it out. Some shame cycles. The counterpart of that, the opposite action of that, is the validation and acceptance. And there is studies out there that show when we do validate our emotional experience, our nervous systems are calmed. If we validate someone else's emotional experience when we're talking to them, their nervous system calms. So gosh, it just can be so valuable. Another component here as to why this emotional work helps so much to soothe the nervous system is if we have these labels in education, understanding what's going on, then we feel like we have a better handle on it. If we can break it into these components, like you were talking about, what isn't an emotion? An emotion has all these different components. And if we can take a moment and say, oh, this part, the physical part feels like this, the cognitive part feels like this, the emotional part feels like this, we can feel like we have a lot better handle on our emotional process. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the Buddhist idea of this craving and aversion. We're either craving something, we desire it, we're pulling ourselves toward it, or we're pushing something away. We have aversion toward it, we're avoiding it. And in the middle way is to neither push it away or neither grasp for it. And if we put that into the lens of anxiety, I have anxiety, I want to push that away, or I'm in a moment where I don't have anxiety, I want to cling to it. That's not the middle way. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that.
The meaning that we place on something is really important when it comes to whether or not our nervous system becomes activated. In this case, my nervous system became activated via feeling sunburn on my arms. Now, I'm guessing 99.9% of people, when they feel sunburn on their arms, don't become anxious after that. The reason why I felt that was because of the meaning that I placed on that experience. The meaning was, oh no, here it comes. This is anxiety. I notice that my arms are feeling sunburned. That's bare sensation. The next thing that happens, even though I may not notice it, is my body processes that information first through my brain, then through my nervous system, and essentially compares it to other past experiences. And if my body, nervous system, and subconscious mind have another situation to relate that to that feels threatening, there will be a nervous system activation response, even before I have that thought, oh no, here it comes. But then having the thought, oh no, here it comes, is going to further reinforce that cycle. The reason why mindfulness is so powerful is we can break this cycle. We can become more aware of this cycle as it's happening. We can relax the nervous system. The power of our conscious attention can give us more control over how our nervous system responds. Here's what's happening. Can I be with this? Can I let some of these processes unfold so that I don't make it worse with this sort of cascade of other things?
So good to be educated on all this to help break it down into the different components. But yeah, our nervous system gets conditioned to react in a certain way in certain situations because of past events. And we can actually undo that. We can actually reteach our nervous system to not be triggered in those events. And the way that I see that happening with my clients and myself is to use mindfulness to notice right away when you get triggered and then come in with an exercise that soothes yourself. And if you do that repetitively, you really can retrain your nervous system. As far as the craving and aversion related to anxiety, what are your thoughts on that, Mike?
All of these tools that we're talking about, they're really important and helpful tools. Even with these tools, it's important that we understand this craving and aversion dichotomy, because we should not cling to this is going to make me feel better, and therefore that's the only acceptable outcome here. What we're doing when we use these tools is we want to be non-attached, to use the Buddhist language, to whatever the outcome is. We're doing the tools to try to soothe ourselves because we know that these tools work. either through past experience or through confidence in the research or the people that we've talked to about it. But if we're attached to this has to make my anxiety go away, we're never going to truly overcome anxiety. We're never going to actually learn to contend with the anxiety. If you imagine grasping your two hands together, this is clinging. If you try to push your hands apart and try to push them as far apart as you can and use all your might to do that, that is detachment. And in the worst case, that is actually aversion because you're trying to push an experience away. If you put your hands together gently in a prayer pose, this is non-attachment. You are still making contact with what is here, but your hands are not gripped to each other. It's easy to separate them. There's no strong sense of attachment. When we have experiences of emotions, let's say anxieties, we tend to cling to wanting things to be a certain way. We cling to the idea that I shouldn't feel this way. We cling to, I want to feel peaceful and happy, all of which are understandable things to want. But the harder we cling to those things, the harder we grip down and grit our teeth and say, no, I need to be peaceful and happy, the harder they actually are to get. And then on the flip side, we have aversion. We want to push away all these painful and uncomfortable feelings in our mind or in our body or in our nervous system. I don't like the way this is feeling. Make it go away. Make it go away. The first noble truth is in life there is suffering. The second noble truth is there is a cause of suffering. Clinging and aversion are the cause of that suffering. This was the Buddha diagnosing the human condition.
So my dog has a brain tumor, and we're probably going to have to put him down in a few days. I can notice myself grasping for him to be not sick, right? To not have all of these terrible symptoms that he's having, to live on this planet longer. I can use my mindfulness to notice, oh, isn't that interesting? I am grasping and clinging to this idea of my dog being better and being on this planet longer. No shame, no pressure, just an observation that this is what I'm doing. And then accepting what is coming through, accepting, yes, I accept that my heart hurts right now. I accept that I'm scared for what things are going to look like for me next week. Yes, I accept this sadness that is in my experience right now, and I will meet it with self-kindness. I will support myself and be tender to myself. It's hard to just take a pause and notice that that's something that we're doing. And there's a lot of reasons we could go on and on about all the reasons why that's hard. But one of them is it's not really supported so much by our society, right? It's like our society is all about grasping, just grabbing, clinging. I do want to go into part 2 here, which is this emotional work is a more healthy way to experience. It's a more aware way to experience. It involves more acceptance, which in my opinion is what leads to the emotional healing. As far as acceptance, creating space and time to feel the emotion. This is something we may not have been taught as children. It's something that feels like it's not possible due to our busy lives, but so important to create that space and time to feel the emotion. And another thing I think is important for that acceptance is to acknowledge that the circumstances are difficult. Let go of this place of pretending that, oh, this is fine, but to be really honest about, this is a situation that is difficult. So for me personally, I have a real issue with fear of failure. So that's one of the ways I meet those experiences is I notice that, oh, those thoughts are going off about, oh my gosh, what if this goes wrong? What if I fail at this? What if this doesn't work out? What if I lose money? I can instead remind myself when I feel like I'm not going to succeed at something, it's really difficult for me. This is one of my biggies. I have a client that's going through kind of grieving the aging process, grieving, youth. And that's an emotional process that looks like anxiety on the outside. But when we do the emotional work instead and create space for that grief, you feel a little bit more comfortable in your body when you move more into the grief than into that anxious state. And a lot of clients say to me, is it okay to feel this way? Do clients sometimes say that to you? And I just say, yes,
Oh, yeah.
it's
There's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. No emotion is right or wrong. Because now not only are you feeling the pain of whatever you're feeling, but now you're feeling like, oh, this is wrong. I shouldn't be feeling this. Or, oh, I'm such a bad person for having this emotion. One of the most common things clients say is they shouldn't be feeling an emotion because like maybe they feel angry about something, or maybe they're anxious about a completely irrational situation, which I know all too well what that feeling is like. We have to start with validating these emotions. Like, there's nothing wrong with feeling an emotion. Going back to this idea of aversion, we have so much aversion to feeling certain ways, and certain emotions are more acceptable, whether they're acceptable in your family system, whether they're acceptable in your society. Some of that is based on gender and other demographics. As I was sitting here listening to you talk about having to put your dog down, and, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. I remember going through that a few years ago, listening to you talk about it. I'm having images in my mind of my old dog. I'm noticing a little bit of tightness in my stomach. I'm noticing, a little bit of almost a pain in my heart. I noticed my breathing rate went up a little bit. That is a very different thing for me to sit here and do than to sit here and say, oh, I feel so bad. When we give these very general names to things, it's very unhelpful. But if I say, okay, here's this physiological sensation that I just noted, here's this image coming into my mind, here's the way my breathing is changing and the way my body feels, I can actually do something with that. And so, on the most practical level, first, you have to know what you're addressing before you can do anything about it. So, this binary of anxious or not anxious, very unhelpful. You can't address that. But if I pause and I say, my breathing is going fast and my stomach feels really tight, then I can sit with those sensations and bring some curious, mindful, non judgmental attention to them, learn to tolerate them, have some sort of kindness towards them, a little bit of self compassion, maybe. And then it's not as bad of a situation. And now notice I'm not putting meaning on that. I'm not saying, oh God, this means I'm about to have a horrible panic attack, or oh, this means I'm a terrible person because I can't kick my anxiety. No, these are just sensations and things in the body. I can deal with that. What is harder to deal with is this giant label of anxiety.
this attaching meaning to some of these things in a way that actually makes it worse, makes me think of assumptions. And that makes me think of cognitive elaboration, which is something happens, we don't have all of the information, so we're filling in the blanks with our own assumptions, which is just a survival technique. It's in our DNA. But this research shows that cognitive elaboration leads to anxiety and depression. Like, that practice is something to really be mindful that you're doing. Say, oh, I'm doing that. I'm making these assumptions. I'm adding this meaning. So I'm so glad that you brought that up.
Yeah. And what percentage of the time are those blanks that you're filling in going to be filled in with puppies and rainbows? Never, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that goes back to survival, right? I mean, our brain works that way because thousands of years ago, that is how our ancestors survived. Yeah. It's like you're in the woods, the tiger's coming at you, and you fill in the blanks. This tiger could run up and bite me. And if we didn't jump to that conclusion, then maybe we wouldn't, save ourselves. So it's based in some logic perfect. But the problem is these days, there aren't tigers running around eating us. So we need to use our mindfulness to do a manual overdrive on our DNA. Otherwise, we go into anxiety and depression. I mean, I truly believe that so much of this anxiety and depression in our world is because of this operating system that we have in our brains that was designed for thousands of years ago, that, our technology has advanced faster and our society has advanced faster than our brain evolution has been able to keep up with. So we're in this pickle, but mindfulness
100%.
is the way out. So, we have these options.
One way to soothe your nervous system is to look for signs of safety, to use your power of mindfulness to get into what is happening right here, right now. And I could do this in real time. So I am sitting here. I've got 4 walls and a roof around me. I have a closed door. There's nobody home in my house. Right there, I have at least a starting point for, okay, there's some degree of safety here. I know that I have temperature control in my house. I know that I have adequate food and water in my house. There's another starting point. These are just the basic necessities of human physiology and biology that we can start with. Now, the problem comes in when I say, and I'm sure many people can relate to this, what if it feels like the threat is coming from inside my own mind? Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of the same thing. We use our power of mindfulness to say, I can be safe in my own mind and body. Do I see any genuine signs of danger within my own mind and body? Trying to connect with that part of your mind that isn't in threat mode, because it's there. It's just being overshadowed by this alarm bell that's ringing very loud in your mind.
That reminds me of a technique that I use called satisfaction levels. And what we do is we just think about things going on in our life. Maybe it's your job, and we put a satisfaction level to it. Am I highly satisfied, minorly satisfied, neutral, not satisfied, and so forth. And then we take a look at some things going on right now in this moment. What is your satisfaction level of the temperature in the room? What is your satisfaction level of the seat that you're sitting in? What is the satisfaction level of the desk that you are sitting in front of? Most of the time, what ends up happening is the satisfaction levels are much higher for the phenomenon that's happening right in this moment. And so it's just such a clear way to see that if I bring my attention to this moment, that it's actually pretty satisfying. Well, Mike, I'm so glad that you're here with us on the show, bringing your expertise on anxiety. I really appreciate it. And I will link in the show notes the emotional clusters, which is the list of the 300 different emotions, which is a great way for listeners to do the emotional work, to start to be aware of some of these deeper underlying emotions that are a little bit more specific and more accurate and more authentic. When we do this emotional work and we start naming these deeper, more specific emotions, then we move more into an authentic experience. Yeah. Thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Could you please tell us a little bit about your practice and how people can get a hold of you?
I run a group psychotherapy practice, myself and 4 other clinicians. My practice is called Strive On Counseling. We offer individual therapy online or in person in Asheville. You can find us at striveon.me. And yeah.
Thanks again for being here. The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD Mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.